Was the Constitution sold on a lie? Shays Rebellion was repeatedly cited by the Federalist side as a primary reason to get rid of the Articles of Confederation and replace it with a stronger central government under the Constitution. But what if the threat was actually exaggerated, whether intentional or not? Well, that's how the Anti-Federalists put it. Even Thomas Jefferson suggested this. And in this episode, we're going to dive deep into that debate and explore James Madison's maybe surprising later admission in 1821 about this pivotal moment in American history. But first of all, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, June 21st, 2024. And I want to kick it off with this. You might be familiar with Thomas Jefferson's probably now famous quote, "A little rebellion now and then is a good thing." He considered a rebellion from time to time as a, quote, medicine necessary for the sound health of government. He saw it as a warning to rulers or people with power that, well, if you get too out of hand, you might have a big problem on your hands. I covered that in an episode that'll be linked to in the show notes. Thomas Jefferson, a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. Now, this was Jefferson responding, discussing things in 1787 about the Shays Rebellion, which I think was done at the point that he had written this letter or these various letters making this case. Now, Meharry described the rebellion like this. It was a violent insurrection, primarily in the western Massachusetts countryside, spurred by anger over state taxes on individuals and their trades. It was brought about by a monetary and debt crisis in the wake of the American Revolution. Now, what went down, basically, Congress was not able to raise money and the troops needed to put it down. And it was eventually handled by basically a private militia raised and funded in the state of Massachusetts, called for by the governor of Massachusetts. And it's interesting enough because this was no small situation. And here from Wikipedia, they point out that 4,000 people signed confessions about this once it was all done. Now, maybe a few extra people put their name on there just for safety reasons, but this is thousands of people signed confessions acknowledging participation in the events of the rebellion in exchange for amnesty. Several hundred participants were eventually indicted on charges related to the rebellion, but most of them were pardoned. There was a general pardon issued by Governor John Hancock, and it excluded only a few ringleaders. Just short version, it was a pretty major situation. But that doesn't mean that, well, we'll get to this here in just a moment. Meharry puts it like this. Shays Rebellion was one of the most prominent reasons given for a system of government more energetic. That was the term that the Federalists generally use, or the founders used to explain or express their idea in support of a more centralized system, a government that had more power in the center, more energetic than the one formed under the Articles. Federalists, who had for years failed to expand congressional power under the Articles of Confederation, and Mike in his article cites a number of examples of how, going all the way back earlier into the 1780s, they tried to expand power, but the amendment process made it very difficult and they weren't able to get it done. They repeatedly cited the Shays crisis as a glaring example of the weakness and insufficiency of the system and a reason for a new one. And you might even get the impression, not to take one side or the other, that they had been trying, and it was almost like a never let a good crisis go to waste situation. As soon as this came up, they really jumped on it, really hammered home how dangerous the situation was or would be going forward, and that you had to actually jump forward with a more powerful system. Here's an example from John Jay, not necessarily being scammy like that, but his view was that the inability to fund troops to put down the uprising in the congressional end of things rather than in the state. He said it actually made the inefficiency of the federal government, it made it become more and more manifest. So in other words, there wasn't enough centralized power to John Jay. George Washington, in a letter to Henry Knox, put it like this. The legality of this convention, that was the upcoming convention in Philadelphia, he was writing in February of 1787. He said, "I do not mean to discuss that, nor how problematical the issue of it may be. The powers are wanting, none can deny." So his view was that no one could deny that Congress or a federal government needed more power. Now, some people disagreed with him on that, but that was his position. Through what medium they are to be derived will, like other matters, engage public attention. That which takes the shortest course to obtain them will, in my opinion, under present circumstances, be found best. In other words, the Federalist view here from George Washington was, we need more power, and we need it to happen quickly. And you see how I'm not really going to get into the quickly part of it, but especially the early parts of the ratification debates in the fall of 1787, there seemed to be a real pressure to rush the thing through. And you see that happen all through history. In a so-called crisis or an emergency situation, we got to get these new powers now. We can't take the time to discuss them. People like Cato and Brutus on the Anti-Federalist side were saying like, whoa, let's slow this down. And Hamilton, writing as Caesar, was basically like, no, you can't slow it down. You can't get amendments. None of this stuff is going to happen, or you're going to get the system at the point of a bayonet. So it was a real heavy pressure approach. So more power, let's get it done quickly. Anyways, Washington continued. The system on which you seem disposed, this is his letter to Henry Knox, to build a national government is certainly more energetic, and I dare say in every point of view is more desirable than the present one, which from experience we find is not only slow, debilitated, and liable to be thwarted by every breath. But if you think about it, just that phrase, a new national government, this was repugnant to the entire principles that was the foundation of what was a confederation of independent sovereign states. That was not a national government. So they were already calling for this and wanting a fully new system. Mike Meharry points out that meanwhile, Federalists pushing for a stronger central government ramped up their efforts as delegates were being chosen for the Philadelphia Convention. In a March 19th, 1787 letter to Thomas Jefferson, James Madison outlined his plan for a much more centralized system. We think of Madison not necessarily being an anti-federalist, but certainly not in the Hamiltonian end of things. But at the Philadelphia Convention, he was calling for power that would have made, well, Hamilton very happy. Madison went as far as to propose the federal government should have veto power over all state legislation. He also called for the federal Congress to basically have power in all cases that they determine is necessary, all cases except where the states are, quote, competent. So basically almost unlimited centralized power. As Madison put it, quote, to arm the federal head with a negative in all cases whatsoever on the local legislatures. Now, a month later, James Madison published a document called Vices of the Political System of the United States. This will be linked to in the show notes. Alan Mosley will get that organized, and I'll get it published a couple of hours after this live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. He's basically going through all the main points of what he sees as the problem in the current system. He's got, man, how many points are there? A dozen or so? I don't know. I don't have the whole list in front of me. Yeah, it looks like 12 of them. And this basically laid the foundation for a new, more centralized proposal called the Virginia Plan, which again would have given centralized power, a national veto power over all state legislation, and nearly unlimited legislative power. This is James Madison, Edmund Randolph. And while that proposal was quickly, well, not almost immediately, but it was absolutely rejected by the Philadelphia Convention, they did produce a proposed constitution that had far more power in the general government than what Congress had under the Articles of Confederation. And during the ratification debates, Federalists repeatedly cited the Shays Rebellion as justification for this additional power. Mike points out that the rebellion was mentioned numerous times, specifically in the Federalist Papers. Alexander Hamilton hammered this over and over. He specifically referenced it starting in Federalist number 6, arguing that a weak central government and its inability to collect taxes to pay veterans of the American Revolution what they were owed led to the conflict. Now, that doesn't mean that Hamilton was totally wrong, but he certainly also wanted to use it to do other things. Now, Henry Lee made a similar argument in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, saying that the lack of power in Congress is what led to this problem. Anti-Federalists had a different take. They didn't necessarily say that the rebellion was awesome or anything, but they thought the source of the problem was something different. Oliver Ellsworth, who ended up being the third Chief Justice of the United States, we've cited him many times favorably, but he got hyperbolic about this. He first argued that additional federal power was, quote, necessary to restrain the violence of seditious citizens. And he really ramped up the hyperbole with this. Had Shays, the malcontent of Massachusetts, been a man of genius, fortune, and address, he might have conquered that state. And by the aid of a little sedition in the other states, and an army proud by victory, became the monarch and tyrant of America. You know, I'm not the expert on the Shays Rebellion, as many others would definitely be, but I've read a decent amount of this, and I don't think there's any indication that these people were really looking to not only take over the state, but on top of it, become monarch and tyrants of the entire country. I think this is just hyperbole. This is fear-mongering at its finest, I guess. And then he ranted up even more. That wasn't enough. Ellsworth said, fortunately, he was checked. But should jealousy prevent vesting these powers in the hands of men chosen by yourselves, and who are under every constitutional restraint, accident or design will in all probability raise up some future Shays to be the tyrant of your children. So again, in other words, grant them these new powers under this totally new system, or you've been lucky so far. If you don't give us new power right now, your children are going to end up in total tyranny. I mean, this is the type of fear-mongering we hear today. Now, Alexander Hamilton hit this exact same hyperbolic approach the very next week, writing in Federalist number 21. He warned that without further centralized power, a tyrant was going to arise from the ashes of the next rebellion. Maybe he was onto something, but it wasn't because there was too little power, but we got a tyrant. We've gotten tyrants because there's too much power. And then in Federalist number 25, Hamilton actually went so far, he was just brazen about this. He went so far as to cite the rebellion as a reason or excuse for the federal government to keep a standing army in peacetime. This is something that virtually the entire founding generation referred to as the bane of liberty. They absolutely hated the idea of a large permanent standing army. And he's saying, like, look, without one, we're going to have all kinds of competing armies being raised up to deal with all these rebellions. This is going to be total chaos and tyranny. And maybe you can take Hamilton's case on this. But the Anti-Federalists certainly weren't having this. And Meharry points out that they argued that none of this justified the expansion and centralization of power proposed by the Constitution. These Anti-Federalists often made the case that the events were overblown and that Massachusetts did, in fact, put down the rebellion in a relatively short amount of time, despite whatever obstacles the articles may have created. For instance, Mike writes, in his 10th essay, Brutus directly challenged Hamilton's assertions in Federalist 25, arguing that the case was totally foreign to Hamilton's purpose, justifying a standing army. He's like, Massachusetts raised a body of troops for 6 months, at the expiration of which they were to be disbanded. This looks very little like a standing army. So it was just raise the troops, raise the militia for the crisis, get it done, disband them. That's how things are supposed to work. But Hamilton is saying, no, we need this permanent standing army. And Mike points out that, in short, Brutus saw that the system worked out as it was supposed to. When the rebellion needed to be stopped, it was, but it was stopped by the state. And William Grayson, the Virginia Ratifying Convention, made a very similar argument, noting that Shays Rebellion was crushed. He said a vote of that august body for 1,500 men, aided by the exertions of the state, silenced all opposition and shortly restored the public tranquility. Massachusetts was satisfied that these internal commotions were so happily settled. And if you think about it, the fact that so many people were pardoned, so many people were given a general amnesty, that means things went to basically a peaceful situation, and no one was worried that there was going to be another attempted overthrow, at least in Massachusetts. Well, I'm not saying no one, but the general take was things were pretty cool. And then we have the Anti-Federalist writer Agrippa in his second paper. Now, Agrippa was actually from and in Massachusetts, so he was there at the time. He also took the position that the Federalist arguments were actually overblown, and that while things were difficult, the state ended up getting the job done. Here, for example, he writes, damage done to individuals during the tumults have been repaired by judgment of the courts of law, and the award has been carried into effect. This is the present state of affairs, when we are asked to relinquish that freedom which produces such happy effects. So he's saying, like, look, we have a decentralized system. We don't need a strong central government. We just fought a long, bloody war to get away from one, something that had unlimited power. Now you're giving us a system that many of us on the Anti-Federalist side think will lead to unlimited power, consolidation, and total tyranny. And why do we need that when the whole system ended up working? It may not have been the most awesome situation out there, but man, we got it done. So he made the case that the rebellion itself was actually being used, in his words, as a trick to get more centralized power. He said, the attempt has been made to deprive us of such a beneficial system and to substitute a rigid one on its head by criminally alarming our fears, exalting certain characters on one side and vilifying them on the other. Sounds familiar to so many things that we experience today. Every time there's a so-called emergency, if you oppose new government power in response to that emergency, you're considered evil and terrible and dumb, whatever. Agrippa went further. Whether they will trust persons who have, from their cradles, been incapable of comprehending any other principles of government than those of absolute power, and who have in this very affair tried to deprive them of their constitutional liberty by a pitiful trick. So he's basically saying, like, look, some of these people who are advocating for more power, everyone knew that people like Hamilton, Governor Morris, and a few others had long wanted more centralized power, maybe even Hamilton wanting another version of a monarchy. And he's saying, like, this is just a trick, and they're just playing on your fear. And if we understand that fear is the foundation of most or all government power, this was a very powerful argument in Massachusetts. Now, Mike points out that a number of Anti-Federalists also seized upon the position that supporters of the Constitution relied on unjustified fear to advance a more powerful central government. We have Melancton Smith of New York writing as a plebeian in April of 1788. Patrick Henry repeatedly hammered on this message in his ratification debate speeches in Virginia. For example, he put it like this: we have the animating fortitude and persevering alacrity of Republican men to carry us through misfortunes and calamities. In other words, we're strong. We've got backbone. If we have problems, calamities, we're going to deal with it. We don't have to come up with a whole new consolidated system. He said that would end up in the destruction of our liberties. Anyways, Henry goes on. It is the fortune of a republic to be able to withstand the stormy ocean of human vicissitudes. Almost like V for Vendetta a little bit. He said, I know of no danger awaiting us. Public and private security are to be found here in the highest degree. Sir, it is the fortune of a free people not to be intimidated by imaginary dangers. Now, in February of 1788, Massachusetts, where the rebellion was primarily centered, had a very close vote in favor of ratification. It was 187 to 168. Sometime in January, they're doing vote counts, and ratification was going to lose. So they made a deal. Okay, if we get some proposed amendments suggested here, then we'll go along with it and we'll roll from there. But it was still very, very close. And Samuel Bryan, probably writing as Sentinel, said a big reason it passed in Massachusetts was fear over Shays. He said the new Constitution was viewed in Massachusetts through the medium of a Shays. The terrors of his insurrection had not subsided. A government that would have been execrated, so basically loathed or reviled, at another time was embraced by many as a refuge from anarchy, and thus liberty, deformed by mad riot and dissension, lost her ablest advocates. I think it's very likely that without that situation, well, maybe they wouldn't have had a Philadelphia Convention in the first place. So it certainly did lead to one thing and then another and another. Now, the Federal Farmer also rejected the notion that the problems were even caused by a lack of centralized government power, because that was really the argument that everyone was making. Like, without additional power, they couldn't raise money, they couldn't raise troops. He's basically saying, like, look, these are totally normal results of a long, costly, and bloody war of independence. They just got out, like, it was just years earlier that they finally wrapped up with the Treaty of Paris. I know the fighting had ended a little bit before that as well, but they went through a very, very insanely crazy situation. He's like, look, we shouldn't be surprised that we've had some problems. But like Patrick Henry was saying, we've got strong people. We've already stood up to one tyrant. When we have problems, we're going to figure it out and we're going to get it done. And that was the argument. They did get it done and they didn't need the additional centralized power. Here's the Federal Farmer. This is in number 17. Again, it'll be linked to in the show notes so you can read it in context and learn more on your own time. He said, our people are like a man just recovering from a severe fit of sickness. It was the war that disturbed the course of commerce, introduced floods of paper money, the stagnation of credit, and threw many valuable men out of steady business. So on top of it, you have the depreciation of the currency, the price inflation as a result. And to get through that is going to be a bit of a struggle. And federal farmers recognizing that more than what most people even recognize or even think about today. He said, from these sources, our greatest evils arise. Men of knowledge and reflection must perceive it. But then, have we not done more in 3 or 4 years past in repairing the injuries of the war by repairing houses and estates, restoring industry, frugality, the fisheries, manufactures, etc., and thereby laying the foundation of good government and of individual and political happiness than any people ever did in a like time? So we have two perspectives here. On the one side, the Federalists are saying, without this additional central power, we're going to have all kinds of crazy problems. And the lack of power to pay people off was the problem. And on the other side, Federalist or Anti-Federalists like the Federal Farmer, they're taking the position like, look, this is the normal course of events after a pretty crazy, intense war that, wow, all odds were against us. We won. And in even just this short amount of time, we've recovered more than anyone could ever have done in the same amount of time. So rather than being a negative, he was seeing the situation as a positive. Now, he called the deficits of the Articles of Confederation, quote, greatly magnified. Now back to Thomas Jefferson. Here in a letter to William Stephen Smith, November of 1787, he said, God forbid we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. And he points out that we have had 13 states independent for 11 years. There has been one rebellion. I'm not sure how he does the math here. He's probably better at it than me. I've got government-run school destroyed by capability sometimes. He said that comes to one rebellion in a century and a half for each state. What country before ever existed a century and a half without a rebellion? And what country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? So he points out, look, this is not yes, I'm not on their side of the rebellion. I don't think it was the right approach. But it's not a bad thing. And in fact, reminding people in charge that they might face this type of thing has a bigger benefit if we zoom out and look at the big picture. He said, our convention, talking about the Philadelphia Convention, has been too much impressed by the insurrection of Massachusetts. And in the spur of the moment, they are setting up a kite to keep the hen yard in order. I've never heard that phrase other than reading Thomas Jefferson say it, but it sounds like he's basically saying, we've got a little problem down here and we're setting up a big overarching solution for it. Something that's too much for what we're facing. Now, check this out. Even James Madison, the guy who was calling for a national veto over the states, more centralized power in the federal government as a defensive measure is what he called it, against the states encroaching on all kinds of things, all kinds of state problems, basically almost unlimited national legislative power because of Shays Rebellion in part. He said, Mike writes, in 1821, James Madison went so far as to admit that the rebellion was overblown and resulted in a more powerful government than what was, he called, warranted. Check this out. A letter to John G. Jackson, December of 1821. He said, what is not to be overlooked? The disposition to give a new system all the vigor consistent with Republican principles was not a little stimulated by a backwardness in some quarters towards a convention for the purpose, which was ascribed to a secret dislike to popular government and a hope that delay would bring it more into disgrace and pave the way for a form of government more congenial with monarchical or aristocratical predilections. So in other words, there were some people who wanted even to slow the process down of expanding power in order to get more of a monarchy setup. So there were some that, and he's not naming names here, but he's saying some people on his Federalist side really wanted even more than what they came up with. He was one of them. Edmund Randolph was another. So was Alexander Hamilton, who in June of 1787 had a crazy proposal that I've covered on another episode. Madison continued, this view of the crisis made it natural for many in the convention to lean to a higher tone system than was perhaps in strictness warranted by a proper distinction between causes temporary, as some of them doubtless were, and causes permanently inherent in popular frames of government. And if we think about how the Federal Farmer put it, he's saying, like, look, the problems that we're facing are temporary. We haven't even let it fully play out. We've already recovered in 3 or 4 years more than any people have ever done at any time. And we've had this horrible war. And Madison seems to be suggesting that he agreed with that. Now, was this in retrospect? Was he lying at the time and then changed his mind? I'm not certain. He did a few flip-flops over time with his views on power before and after ratification. It seems like this is kind of a mea culpa here, but I'll leave that for you to decide. So he's basically saying the view of this crisis was, we're going to have a higher tone system, more power than what was in strictness warranted by the situation. And he went further. He said, I was among those most anxious to rescue the system from danger which seemed to threaten it, the system of self-government. And with that view, he wrote, was willing to give a government resting on that foundation as much energy as would ensure the requisite stability and efficacy. It is possible that in some instances that considerations may have been allowed a weight greater than subsequent reflection within the convention or the actual operation of the government would sanction. So it does seem kind of like James Madison is really doing a bit of a mea culpa here. Like when I look back on it, it seems like we were a little hasty in how much power we were giving them. And so I guess the question still remains, was the Constitution sold on a lie? Now, I think it's possible that maybe that's overstating things, or maybe it's just another case of never let a good crisis go to waste, which seems to be the most common approach for people who want more power. And I personally take a lot of pride in doing my best to tell the whole story about the Constitution. If you watch or listen to many episodes of the show, you're going to see and hear things that might sound pretty awesome about the Constitution and the founders. And sometimes, maybe like this one, maybe not. But if you want to help me reach and teach more people with this essential history, this essential truth, the full picture, nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. We've been at this for almost 18 years. We're celebrating our 18-year anniversary just this next week, and you can help us kick off the next 18 with a strong foundation for liberty by joining us as a member for as little as $2 a month. You got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat. Please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options available. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something. I hope you, enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed putting it together to share with you. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I hope to see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.